Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's webinar on the subject of timber marketing. My name is Martin Glynn. I'm speaking on behalf of RDI Associates Limited, who are the hosts of this evening's webinar. Can you please leave your microphone on mute? You have all been muted, but please leave it on mute. We will be using the chat function to ask any questions. So if you do want to ask a question this evening, can you please put it in the chat function? You can find that by moving your cursor to the bottom of your screen, or if you're on a tablet, tapping at the bottom of the screen, and you will see an icon there with chat. If you tap or click on that, you will see that you can type in your question. When it then comes to the end of the session, we will ask you to unmute yourself and ask a question if you want to. If you don't want to do that, we can ask it on your behalf. Please just tap back to your question if necessary. And as already mentioned, we will be recording this webinar, and we are actually recording now to make it available online on YouTube for those who weren't able to join us this evening. Just a little bit about RDI Associates. It's a forestry and project delivery company working for not just forestry projects, but across sort of training, climate change, renewable energy and the like. We're joined this evening by Will Richardson, the director of RDI Associates, who's a chartered forester who will be talking about the subject this evening. And myself, I work with Will at RDI Associates. I'm also a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Foresters. Will and I both have a great deal of experience in the industry. We're also joined this evening by Stephen Parr, who's a general manager at Euroforest. Pleased to say he's been able to join us this evening, and we'll be talking about the subject of timber marketing. So this evening's webinar, along with the rest of the programme, is part of the Woodland Management Focus Area Pilot Project, which has been funded by the Forestry Commission through the Woods into Management Forestry Innovation Fund. And what we're doing in this project is using GIS, that's Geographic Information Systems, to identify clusters or focus areas of unmanaged woodlands. And then we'll be working with the owners in those areas to help them bring those woodlands into management. We're also holding this programme of woodland webinars, of which I think this is the 4th in the series, more to come. We'll talk about that at the end of this evening's webinar. And then, as I said earlier on, providing landowners support and advice in the focus areas and undertaking an evaluation of woodland status against the United Kingdom forestry standard. And for those woodland owners who we do provide support to, we can talk to them about that a bit more. So I'm now going to pass over to Will Richardson, who's going to talk to us about the subject of this evening's webinar. Thank you, Will.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. It's all about timber marketing and sales. And we'll just give you a broad introduction to the topic, really. As with our past webinars, we haven't got much time, but hopefully we'll introduce some key concepts about timber sales and marketing. I'll start with an introduction to sort of key considerations, things that you definitely want to bear in mind. We'll then look at different grades of timber and how that affects the price that you might expect for that timber. We'll talk about sale agreements. So if you are going to sell your timber, whether it's standing, roadside, there are various options there. Again, key elements to consider there. And I'll introduce certification schemes, what they're about, what they mean, and what's out there for you, the woodland owner. And then we'll introduce Stephen from Euroforest. Hopefully he can give us an up-to-date industry perspective on this topic. And we'll go for a Q&A as well. We're also joined by Richard Powell from the Forestry Commission. So if there's anything relevant, any questions or queries relevant to, again, particulars, we introduced the topic last week on regulation, licensing, etc. Richard's here to help out, so that's great. So, make sure I click the right button. So, what we're assuming here, if you want to sell your timber, get somebody interested in buying it, the various options, we'll talk about those in a little bit later. But obviously, we're assuming that you'll need certain things in place. That will include things like felling licenses, and you will need some basic understanding of what you've got to sell. So whether that's the species, the volume that you might have, number of trees, etc. So there's some assumptions that we're starting with. Of course, we've covered felling licenses, regulations in a previous session. We'll talk about management planning in a later session. That was one of the ones that was postponed from the end of last year. We swapped with the Storm Arwen wind blow presentation. So we'll talk about management plans at a later session. And under that one, we'll also talk about, understanding your standard trees a bit better, inventories, basic volume data, that kind of thing. Selling your timber, consideration. So why are you selling? What are your objectives? Are they silvicultural? Are you looking for biodiversity improvements in your wood? Are you looking for financial return? Are the cash flow considerations there? Have you considered the state of the timber market? We'll talk about that in a bit more detail a little bit later. Have you informed stakeholders that you're going to do the work? So any tenants, neighbours, family members? That all sounds obvious, but it's easy to miss these out. And of course, statutory obligations as well. That should have been covered under securing a felling license and or getting your management plan in place. Site constraints. So by this, again, you should have brought these out during your felling license application or management planning processes. So considerations for historic environment, biodiversity, ground conditions and terrain. The industry is very keen on ensuring that we are taking all these key site constraints into consideration when harvesting timber, in particular things like ground conditions, soils, and what impact a forestry operation might have on those in terms of damage to soil, diffuse pollution, etc. These are all key and important considerations that we need to bear in mind. Do you have any restricted covenants or legal complications on your woodland? Again, this may link to stakeholders, such as joint ownership, that kind of thing. What's the access like, not just getting to the wood, but within the woodland as well? Do you have existing rides, tracks, that kind of thing that you can take advantage of? And of course, access for timber wagons on the highway. There are timber transport groups that cover the northeast and Yorkshire and Humber, and there are agreed routes maps for moving timber on the highway, and it's well worth looking into those as well as part of your planning process. Further considerations would be clear mapping of the boundaries of the area that you want to fill, identification of hazards, that might be overhead power lines, underground services, water courses, public rights of way, existing buildings. It's a long list there to think about. Of course, I mentioned access routes, and then maybe other key features as well that you might want to consider, such as the shape of the compartment you might be felling, how you might want it to look after the felling operation has taken place. Of course, health and safety, this is a theme that we will be repeating throughout our presentations. Very important, looking at risk assessments, contractor competencies, what we in the industry call things like pre-start meetings. So you meet with your contractor beforehand, agree how the site will be felled, where the hazards are, make sure they're all mapped, etc. And there's something, again, we refer to in the industry as an emergency response card. So you set out all the contact details for the site in question, such as grid references. A lot of people are using what 3 words now to identify the location of sites, how emergency services can access the site, what mobile phone signals are like, that kind of thing. Again, these are all considerations for you. Under health and safety, again, another common theme that we've spoken about before is the roles and responsibilities of you, the woodland owner, the contractor, who plays the role of what's called the forest works manager, i.e. who's commissioning the work, who's responsible for ensuring it takes place in a safe manner. Then, of course, insurance requirements, public liability, very, very important. Sale agreement, so consider what sort of sale agreement you have. I'll talk about some key pointers in a sale agreement a little bit later. And then, of course, contract management. Who's going to do the contract management? You, the woodland owner, your forest works manager. How's that going to happen? So there's some key considerations from the outset. So what options have you got for selling your timber? So I've simplified it, three main areas: standing. So basically you sell the timber as it stood in the woodland, the tree, in effect. The buyer would provide a standing price whereby they fell, extract and market the timber and pay you an agreed price, either by ton, by product, so by grade. I'll talk about that in a little bit of detail in a second. Or average out term. So that would be an average price paid for all grades. For thinnings, you can mark the timber yourself, or you can ask the operator stroke feller to select the trees for you. You can sell roadside, so it would be your responsibility to fell, extract and dress if necessary, and present the timber roadside for buyers to purchase. And you'd be looking at a price per ton per product for that. And then the third option is delivered. You fell, extract and deliver the timber to an end user stroke market, and you'd be looking again at a price per ton per product. So the common way for a lot of woodland owners would be to sell the timber standing, particularly if it's mixed stands, and possibly lower grade timber. Where you may have very high grade hardwoods, for example, you may decide that you want to choose a roadside sale. There is the option of going through an auction. The timber auction site can help with this process for you, and we can provide a link to that in the follow-up email. But essentially, they would help you to sell the timber on a standing basis. So just very simplified, I'm afraid, terrible drawing, different grades that you might find within your standing crop. So there's our tree. I don't know, they don't all look like that, thankfully, but hopefully you get the idea. So you've got your stump and roots at the bottom, roughly 20% of the mass of the tree. And then as you go up, you look at different grades that are grown within that timber. So you'd expect from a thinnings tree that the majority of it would be what we would call small roundwood, so lower value timber, pulpwood, chipwood, that kind of thing. So your diameters are smaller than, let's say, 16 centimeters. And then the top part of the tree is your brash, lop and top, which sometimes is left on site. The harvesting contractors use it as a brash mat to run on particularly sites with wet soils or sensitive soils, or it can be collected and sold as biomass chip. If we look at the different grades of, let's say, a final crop tree, this is what you really want to be growing for, is higher value saw logs. So you'd expect a higher proportion of that final crop tree to be of saw log quality and different higher product grades, such as pallet, packaging and fencing material. You're also going to be looking at getting a proportion of small roundwood from there, pulpwood and chipwood again, and of course your lop, top and brash. But again, they will be proportionately smaller than, let's say, your thinnings tree. If you've got mixed hardwood stands, then you'd be expecting your early thinnings to predominantly go as firewood. And of course, older trees, again, a lot would go as firewood grade, but hopefully you'd be looking at higher grade hardwoods for carcassing, for example, second grade saw logs as well, that might go into the furniture market. So these timber grades. So this slide just gives you the definition of, how would we define a saw log? So saw logs want to be clean and straight and have a 16 centimetre minimum top diameter, i.e. nothing really smaller than 16 centimetres. And they can be sold in different lengths. So we've got 3.1, 3.7 and 4.9 metre lengths. Pallet wood, so you're looking at maybe slight bows, some knots in it, and slightly smaller diameter, but going up to around about 24 centimetres. Fencing, again, slight bows, some knots, similar sort of size of log to pallet wood. And then with our small round wood, which would make up our chip wood, you're looking at, obviously lower grade knots, bows, and down to quite a narrow diameter, 7 centimetres there. You might have heard references to green and red logs. There's slight differences there. The green logs tend to be the highest quality, straight, no knots, and then red logs are slightly lower quality. I don't hear those terms referred to that often these days, but I'm assuming that a lot of timber buyers out there will still refer to those terms. Timber grades in terms of hardwoods. So we've got obviously highest quality planking material. So again, you'd be looking at clean, straight, larger diameter that would go into the furniture market. Beams, these would be second grade oak logs in particular. Again, want to be relatively clean and straight. And these would go for exterior and interior constructions and architectural markets. So it's quite fashionable nowadays to look at green oak timber framing. That's the kind of product that would go into making that. Fencing, we don't tend to use hardwoods that much in the north of England for fencing. That tends to be further south where they grow more sweet chestnut, which can go into the fencing market. We tend to use softwoods for our fencing markets up here. But lower quality oak can go to that, as can chestnut. And then you've got cordwood, lowest grade for oak, and that would mostly go into the firewood market. And then you've got saw logs of other species, ash, beech, and sycamore. They can vary in terms of the demand for those. It can be quite regional, that demand. But nevertheless, if you've got clean, straight, good quality, good diameter ash, beech, and sycamore, they can still fetch attractive prices. Then, of course, a lot of hardwoods, particularly in the north of England, go to the firewood market. This is usually thinnings, hardwood thinnings. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of ash come into that market now because of the ash dieback situation. Again, this is another term you may have heard of, is volume measured in cubic meters or hoppers feet. So this slide just introduces what hoppers feet is, just so you know. It goes back quite a long way. Edward Hoppus, who described this method of estimating volume of marketable hardwoods, goes back to 1736. So we're still using the term now. But it's essentially, it's the utilizable volume of the log. So once you've taken away the bit you can't utilize, that's your hoppers. And I've given you some conversion factors there, converting hoppers to cubic meter to hoppers. So again, just so you're aware, we don't tend to, particularly with softwoods and hardwood firewood, we tend to measure on a cubic meter basis, and hoppers is only usually left for higher value hardwoods, in particular oak. Weight versus volume, again, just some useful introductory information for you. So with weight, it's the weight of the timber that goes over a weigh bridge on a timber wagon. And your timber merchant would pay you a price per ton per product on that basis. So with volume, it's unusual that you'd get paid by volume. That's only if you can't access a weighbridge, or so for your own use, for example. But I would certainly go for weighing timber over a weighbridge and being paid on that basis. With volume, you're obviously measuring it. There's more room for error there as well. That's down to your measurements in terms of log volume and stack volume. So there is room for, let's call it, user error on that basis. Okay, costs. So just some pointers to costs in terms of what you might expect or start to think about making judgments on this. For getting your timber sold, you may need to think about what costs are associated with your infrastructure in your woodland. Roads, hard standing, turning circles may be needed. Don't forget some of these machines are quite big, particularly timber wagons. You want to get those as close to your point of harvest as possible. Upgrading roads, £25 a metre upwards, and again, new forest roads, anywhere upwards from £65 a metre. Depends. You've got access to stone on site, and you've got to bring it in. It can be significantly more than that. Harvesting, mechanised harvesting can range from quite low prices per tonne if it's big, flat, easy accessible, good quality timber, big clear fell sites, to higher prices for smaller sites, more difficult to access, lower volumes of harvestable material. These ranges are high because of those reasons, because of the variability. You've got to think about extraction to roadside. So you've felled the timber, you've then got to forward it from the felling point to an area where it can be collected by a timber wagon. So again, costs there. And then of course the final haulage from your woodland to the mill, to the customer. Again, that depends on distance and accessibility to your woodland. So there's just some pointers there, but it will be specific to your own situation in your own woodland. So just to give you some idea of prices, these are slightly out of date, well, a few months old now, but saw logs are still fetching a reasonable price, but we have seen prices for lower grade timber even out in recent weeks. Over the last sort of 18-24 months, we have seen rises in prices, but those have started to steady off a bit there. If you've got mixed stands of hardwood, they are still fetching a reasonable price. The demand for hardwood firewood is still good, and obviously a cold spell in the winter does help the firewood guys to sell firewood, and that can help keep those prices healthy. But again, these will be specific to your own situations, and those prices there are delivered, i.e. you still need to bear in mind what your harvesting, extraction and delivery costs are going to be in all of that. Just to give you some roadside hardwood prices, this is in hoppers foot. So you're looking at premium grade oak planking at around £12 per hoppers foot. And that can fall down to 8 for lower grade. And then your sort of white ash and sycamore logs, obviously much less demand, and so they fetch a much lower price. But of course, still more valuable than firewood grade. So sale agreements, key points to consider. So I would recommend this. I would recommend, if you are going to sell your timber, whether it's standing, roadside, to have an agreement in place. And within that agreement, there's some key pointers here. So an accurate description of what you are selling. So there's no ambiguity. So you're clear and your buyer is clear. Information about regulatory requirements. So you've got a felling license. What's that felling license number? Show your buyer a copy of the felling license. What price is being offered, and what are the method and terms of payment? Again, iron out any potential ambiguity there. And then set out any special conditions that you might want to set as the woodland owner. So site conditions, timings of operations. There may be constraints on timings of timber wagon movements, for example. And of course, health and safety at work requirements as well. Again, we've referred to this in all our presentations so far, and that's this. The Forest Industry Safety Accord have got some great guidance and advice for woodland owners out there. So think about damage and how that needs to be reinstated. So making good damage to any tracks or boundaries in that agreement. Insurance and indemnity, it's a pretty obvious one. Biosecurity, I'd certainly have that in. What are the biosecurity requirements for the site? Requirements for termination, whatever they may be, severe weather, ground condition, fire, windblow events, all sorts of things can happen. And then your timeline, start and end dates. So just a quick one on certification schemes, a lot of logos there, but the logo soup. You may be aware of some of these, if not all of them. FSC and PFC certify against the UK Woodland Assurance Scheme. And it's sort of the next stage on from your UK Forestry Standard Compliant Management Plan. This allows you to market your timber as FSC and or PFC certified, and that can be an attractive proposition for some of the mills out there, particularly if they're looking to increase their proportion of certified material. You can get market advantages with that. What I would say is you want to be harvesting a reasonable amount of timber each year to make that worthwhile. Grown in Britain is a similar scheme, but it's provenance based. So FSC, PFC, you can be certified to those standards wherever you are in the world, essentially. Whereas obviously with Grown in Britain, it's about timber from Britain. But you still go through similar sustainability and legality checks. And of course, if you are involved in firewood production, this will be the theme of next week's seminar. There's the ready to burn and woodshore standards. As I say, this will be the theme for next week's seminar. So, like I say, next week's webinar. So, Martin, it's kind of open to the Q&A now, and I'd quite like to bring in Stephen as well. He might be able to add some useful pointers to that, or maybe develop a couple of those themes that we've introduced.
Thanks, Will. That was great. Yeah, Stephen, have you sort of got anything you want to add before we go into any questions from anybody? You know, if anybody does want to ask any questions, please put it in the chat. Let us know. But before that, Stephen, have you got anything you want to add at all?
Well, covered quite a lot of good topics and points there. One of the couple of notes I made were there's quite a lot of diseases going around at the minute, killing larch and ash trees in particular. So it's something to be aware of in your own woodlands. It may be that you get a statutory plant health notice from the Forestry Commission to fell larch. So it's something to consider if you're a woodland owner. Again, ash dieback as well. It's pretty hard to see in the winter months, but certainly spring, summer, you may see your ash trees starting to look a bit withered and dying back. So it's maybe something to consider going forward about clearing ash trees. One of the other things as well, sort of after harvesting is completed, one of the costs to consider would be sort of reinstatement and restocking as well, restocking costs. That will need to be worked in as well into the costs. But again, when you're applying for a felling license, you submit restocking proposals at that time as well. And another thing as well that I noted down, potentially, if access is okay, brash recovery. So some of the biomass mills now take brash and use it to burn to produce electricity or heat. So as well, if access is okay and the economics allow, you could export your brash to roadside and chip into wagons and take it to the biomass plant.
Thanks, Stephen. That's very helpful. Great, that's good. I'm just sort of wondering, I'm putting a question myself, really. I'm just thinking from the point of view of a small woodland owner, and I know, a friend of mine's got a small area that they're thinking about felling soon. And I know one of the things that she said to me is that they sort of find the whole idea of an agreement and these written agreement and a contract and all that sort of stuff quite daunting. Are there any, sort of template agreements or any guides that perhaps either you, Stephen, or Will can give on that in terms of, rather than it just being, done on a handshake, which might have been done years ago, how that can happen?
I mean, obviously, Martin, what I have to say is the easy get out here is get your lawyer involved, but that's an additional expense you might not necessarily need. They can be fairly straightforward, a sale agreement. It doesn't have to be overly onerous, but obviously we'll make these slides available. And they're the key, I've put out some of the key considerations there that you want to build into it. I don't know of any sort of off-the-shelf templates. I tend to do them fairly bespoke as and when needed. But there are common themes such as, abiding by health and safety at work act regulations, requirements for public liability insurances. But, in terms of the price and how you want that paid, then that would be down to you and the buyer to agree that ultimately. There's certain things that only you would be able to set out, as it were. I mean, if there are people with specific cases, then I'm sure we can discuss further, whether it's myself or Stephen. I don't know if you want to come in there, Stephen.
It's very important that you get the prices in writing and both parties sign up to them. I suppose specifics as well in terms of if you have to cross tracks, for example, who's going to be liable for that, for reinstatement costs, if you have to forward timber over a track or a road, who's responsible for that. So there are, I suppose, a couple of templates. They're quite commercial forestry based, but you could download them off the Forestry Commission website, based domains, and I know the Institute of Chartered Foresters have their own contract as well. I don't know if that's readily available or not, but it gives quite a lot of useful information in it as well to cover your sort of works that go wrong.
Right, thank you. Yeah. Good, thanks for that, Stephen. We'll look into that, and if there are anything, we'll include the links in a future email about future presentations. Anyway, so thanks. So, a question from Liam Plummer, who I'm going to ask you on his behalf. She's saying, would you be able to talk a bit about how to find markets, especially perhaps local markets for smaller volumes of timber, directories, niche wooden product users, etc.? Will, have you got any thoughts on that?
There used to be, didn't there? There used to be, was it woodlots? Yeah, that sadly just didn't maintain them. It started off, it was quite a good place to sell, small volumes of timber to niche markets, but it just wasn't able to maintain that momentum. I don't know if it's still going, actually. I don't think so.
I don't think so.
No. Obviously, the easy one is firewood. You can always find local firewood merchants that would take it directly. Other grades, it's tricky, isn't it? I mean, you sometimes find people with things like mobile sawmills that might be interested in the odd, decent piece of hardwood, oak, beech, sweet chestnut, sycamore, that kind of thing that they can plank up. Yeah, there used to be directories. They were pretty handy, but there just wasn't the momentum to sustain them. Again, I don't know if Stephen's got any suggestions on smaller volumes and niche products.
No, yeah, I suppose again it very much depends on yeah, the volumes you're bringing to the roadside. In some cases, we did quite a lot of work in South Scotland, and the timber ends up in Hull, that area, just to supply niche markets, Douglas fir and oak, for example. So it does sort of pay to look in your sort of local directories, Google searches as well. Often come up with quite a lot of sawmills, cabinet makers, firewood merchants. Yes, phoning companies like ourselves as well. We have access to quite a lot of markets as well, and local suppliers. There are a lot of local farmers now who have biomass in the farms. We do supply quite a lot of local farmers who sort of burn biomass to heat the houses or heat the cattle sheds as well.
Yeah,
we're looking into that.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. That's a good suggestion, particularly for lower grade material, isn't it? You know, only a few miles away, you're saving a lot of transport time and cost there, aren't you? Yeah, I think it's a question of researching, as Stephen says, you know, who's local to you, cabinet makers, green woodworkers, that kind of thing, depending where you are. But yeah, I don't know any sort of centralized point of information that would give that these days, sadly.
Yeah. Thanks, Will. I mean, I think as you both raised there, you know, ideally the more local the buyer, the better, because it reduces your cost and it reduces timber miles. You know, there's been a lot of talk recently about reducing food miles, but the same goes for timber. So if you can find somebody and it saves putting it on the back of a lorry, you're save an operation there and increase the income to yourself. And as you know, as well as Stephen said, that's a question of looking around various sources and things, doing some online searches and the like. If you're over in Cumbria or perhaps near Cumbria, it might be worth looking on the Cumbria Woodlands website. They have a directory there. Not necessarily about markets, more about contractors and the like, but it may well be worth having a look there and ringing around. I mean, sadly, a lot of smaller hardwood mills in particular have gone out of business over the last sort of 20 years or so, and there are very few left now, but there are a few around about in the north of England still. And really on that, you know, just perhaps a quick phone call and email to somebody like Will or myself or Stephen or, you know, a local forester who might be able to help you with that anyway. So okay. I think in the absence of any further questions, we're going to wind up this evening's webinar. Unless, as I say, your last opportunity, if anybody has got a further question. Will, do you just want to say a little bit more about the subject of next week's?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I just possibly just reiterate. Don't be put off by this. You know, if you are interested in getting your woods thinned or timber sold, don't be put off. Well, probably have put you off, haven't I? I think that's what I've done. That's why there's silence out there. But don't be put off. It can be more straightforward than you think. There are very good reasons to thin your woods. We've introduced various topics already in past webinars about the reasons for doing it. Biodiversity improvements, health of your woodland. You know, Stephen mentioned larch disease and ash disease. You know, thinning is good woodland practice, good forestry practice. But don't let what I've presented put you off the idea. It can be more straightforward than you think. And of course, you know, there are ourselves and Stephen and companies like his that are very happy to help you and you know, walk you through these processes. So yeah, just thought I'd reiterate that. So yeah, next week we're going to talk about predominantly firewood production. We've got Neil Harrison, who's been in the industry for a long time, to do that presentation. But We'll talk about obviously, producing firewood from your own woods, obviously its use, and then maybe if you wanted to sell it on yourselves. And obviously mentioned this ready to burn standard certification scheme. It's a requirement now to sell if you're selling to end users dry firewood less than 20%. That doesn't necessarily have to be kiln dried, it can be naturally seasoned. So all these key issues will be introduced in next week's seminar.
Will, could I just come in with thank you, with a suggestion. Really, it's not directly related to the regulations side, but just reflecting on how difficult it can be to understand where and how to market your timber if you're new to it. I do sympathise. I recently bought 4 acres of land that was a hay meadow, and I had no idea what hay was worth, how to market it, whether to sell it standing, as it were, or to cut it and sell it, etc., etc. So I do know and understand forestry markets and prices and how all that works. So I kind of get how it feels not to know. And I just wonder, as an output from this process, Will and Martin, whether you could perhaps take some of the work that was done under Roots to Prosperity in identifying, the main markets, the kind of timber they're after, the ballpark prices, the main softwood, the main hardwood markets. It's the kind of thing I think you could probably do quite rapidly. And I think that intelligence would be really welcomed by people that are fairly new to it and are probably feeling a little bit puzzled as to roughly what stuff's worth, who might be interested, etc. So just a suggestion, but I do think that would be a really worthwhile thing to do.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. We'll certainly look at that and see whether that's something we might be able to do as part of this project, and we'll communicate that with everybody who's joined the various webinars over the weeks that we've been running these. I think Will and my background, and Richard's to a certain extent as well, is in trying to help owners and managers of small woodlands going back 20 plus years, and a lot of the work we were doing then is still very relevant in that sense. I suppose the one thing that has changed, and I think is in all your favours, is that timber prices have increased quite significantly in that time. And whereas a small parcel of timber, of a few tens or low hundreds of cubic meters of timber perhaps might not have been worth marketing at that point, is now usually worth doing so, because there is usually a surplus to be made in it, which can be reinvested in the woodland, replanting if necessary, or whatever. So it can make it worthwhile these days. So yeah.
And I think the recent storm Arwen, putting roughly the equivalent of annual cut on the ground in one go. And questions, a lot of questions being asked of what do I do with this, how do I sell it, etc., etc. I think there's a need for us to kind of respond to that. So great. Okay, thanks, Richard. Thanks also, Will and Stephen, for joining us this evening. That's been really helpful. And thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. I hope you found it useful. Just do remember, you can always drop us a line if you've got any further questions or queries about the subject of either this evening's webinar or anything to do with about bringing unmanaged woodland into management. And next week, as Will said, we've got Neil Harrison from Reheat, who's going to be talking to us about producing and using firewood and biomass on your own property in particular. So that's it for this evening, and we'll see you next week, same place, same time, 5 o'clock next Tuesday. Thank you and goodbye, everybody. Bye-bye. Thanks, guys.
Bye.